Imagine for a moment that on the night of April 14th, 1912, the North Atlantic was just a little bit warmer. Imagine that the iceberg that would become history's most infamous floating glacier had melted just enough to drift slightly southward out of the Titanic's path. Imagine that the lookout spotted the danger 5 seconds earlier, or that the ship's turn to port was just a fraction more responsive. In that single moment, everything changes. The Titanic completes its maiden voyage, docking triumphantly in New York Harbor to thunderous applause and international celebration. But this isn't just about one ship making it safely to port. This is about how one disaster that never happened would ripple through time, reshaping maritime history, technology, culture, and even the fate of families who would have lived entirely different lives. What you're about to experience is a deep exploration into an alternate reality where the Titanic's story isn't one of tragedy, but of triumph, and how that one change would transform our world in ways you never imagined. Stay with me until the end, because the connections we're about to uncover will blow your mind. Before we dive into this incredible journey through an alternate timeline, I need your help with something really important. We're aiming for a collective goal of 100 comments on this video, and I need you to watch until the very end. Why? Because when you stay until the final second and leave a comment, YouTube's algorithm remembers you first. You'll be prioritized for our next documentaries, getting notifications before anyone else. Those who watch completely and engage are always at the front of the line. So please, hit that subscribe button right now, because together we're building a community that explores the most fascinating what-if scenarios in history. We need to reach this milestone to keep bringing you more inspiring documentaries like this one. Your subscription ensures you won't miss a single story. And trust me, what you're about to discover will completely change how you think about one of history's most famous disasters. When the RMS Titanic left Southampton on April 10th, 1912, she carried more than 2,200 souls aboard the most luxurious vessel ever constructed. She was the pride of the White Star Line, a floating palace that represented humanity's conquest over nature, the ultimate symbol of Edwardian confidence and technological prowess. The ship's designers had incorporated the latest safety features available at the time, including 16 watertight compartments and electrically operated watertight doors. She could theoretically survive with 4 of these compartments flooded. The problem was that the iceberg she struck opened 6 of them to the sea, but in our alternate timeline, that collision never occurs. The ship steams confidently across the Atlantic, her passengers blissfully unaware of the catastrophe they've just avoided, arriving in New York on April 17th as scheduled. Picture the scene at Pier 59 in Manhattan. Thousands of spectators line the waterfront, craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the magnificent vessel that had captured the world's imagination. Newspaper reporters swarm the docks, ready to interview first-class passengers about their experience aboard the floating marvel. The wealthy elite disembark in their finest attire, ready to share stories of opulent dining rooms, grand staircases, Turkish baths, and a level of luxury that land-based hotels could scarcely match. The immigrants in third class, many of them seeking new lives in America, step onto American soil with their dreams intact, ready to contribute to the great melting pot of early 20th century America. Among them are families whose descendants would go completely untraced in our timeline, because in our reality they perished in the freezing waters of the North Atlantic. But here they live, they prosper, and their bloodlines continue. The immediate impact of the Titanic's successful maiden voyage would have been a massive boost to the White Star Line's reputation and the British shipbuilding industry as a whole. Instead of becoming synonymous with hubris and disaster, the name Titanic would have stood for achievement and engineering excellence. Her sister ship, the HMHS Britannic, would never have been converted into a hospital ship during World War I, because the design flaws exposed by the Titanic disaster wouldn't have been discovered in the same way. In fact, the entire Olympic-class series of ships would have continued operating as luxury liners throughout the early 20th century, each one gradually improving upon the last, without the shadow of tragedy hanging over their design. But the most significant change wouldn't have been in ship design or corporate reputation. It would have been in maritime safety regulations, or rather, the lack thereof. You see, the sinking of the Titanic directly led to the first international convention for the safety of life at sea, known as SOLAS, which was held in London in 1913, just 1 year after the disaster. This convention established groundbreaking safety requirements that are still in effect today. Ships were required to carry enough lifeboats for every person aboard. Radio communications became mandatory, with operators required to maintain 24-hour watches. Ice patrols were established in the North Atlantic to track and report the locations of dangerous icebergs. Distress signal procedures were standardized internationally. All of these changes came directly from the lessons learned when the Titanic went down with 1,500 lives. Without the disaster, these regulations would have taken years, possibly decades longer to implement. The complacency that characterized early 20th century maritime safety would have continued unchallenged. Other ships would have continued sailing with insufficient lifeboats, because the prevailing wisdom was that lifeboats were primarily for transferring passengers to rescue vessels, not for saving everyone aboard a sinking ship. The idea that a ship as large and modern as the Titanic could sink in less than 3 hours was simply inconceivable to most people before it actually happened. Without that wake-up call, how many other ships would have gone down with tragic loss of life before the industry finally recognized the need for comprehensive safety reforms? The Empress of Ireland, which sank in 1914 with over 1,000 casualties, might have taken even more lives. The Lusitania's sinking in 1915 might have been even more catastrophic. We might have seen preventable maritime disasters continuing well into the 1920s and beyond. Let's talk about the people who would have lived. Among the passengers who perished on the Titanic were some of the wealthiest individuals in the world. John Jacob Astor IV, one of the richest men in America, went down with the ship. His death transferred his vast fortune to his pregnant wife Madeline, who gave birth to their son John Jacob Astor VI just months later. But if Astor had survived, his influence on early 20th century business, real estate, and even military affairs would have continued. He was an inventor and an author, and his continued presence might have shaped New York's development in different ways. Benjamin Guggenheim, another mining magnate and businessman, also perished. His survival would have kept substantial capital and influence within his immediate family, rather than being dispersed among relatives and estate executors. Isidore and Ida Strauss, co-owners of Macy's department store, died together, refusing to be separated. Their love story became legendary precisely because of how they died, but their continued leadership of one of America's most important retail establishments would have influenced the consumer culture of the early 20th century. But even more fascinating are the ordinary people whose survival would have created entirely different family trees. There were hundreds of immigrants in third class, many of them young people starting new lives. Every single person who died that night represents not just one lost life, but entire branches of potential descendants who were never born. Think about it statistically. If even half of the 1,500 victims had survived and gone on to have normal family lives, we could be talking about tens of thousands of people living today who simply don't exist in our timeline. Some of those descendants might have become influential politicians, groundbreaking scientists, celebrated artists, or innovative entrepreneurs. The cumulative impact of all those unlived lives is staggering. Somewhere in that alternate timeline, there might be a Nobel Prize winner whose great-great-grandfather survived the Titanic's successful voyage. But in our world, that ancestor died in the freezing water, and that Nobel Prize was won by someone else, or perhaps never won at all. The cultural impact of a successful Titanic voyage would have been equally profound. Instead of becoming the ultimate cautionary tale about human arrogance and the limits of technology, the Titanic would have been celebrated as proof that humanity could indeed conquer nature through engineering and design. The early 20th century was already characterized by tremendous optimism about technological progress. The Titanic's success would have reinforced that optimism, perhaps even amplified it. The Edwardian era's confidence in human achievement would have sailed triumphantly into the 1920s without the sobering reminder that nature still held power over human ambition. This cultural shift might seem subtle, but it would have influenced everything from literature to philosophy to public policy in the years leading up to World War I. Speaking of literature, we would have lost one of the 20th century's most enduring disaster narratives. The story of the Titanic has been told and retold in countless books, films, documentaries, and other media. Walter Lord's A Night to Remember would never have been written. James Cameron's blockbuster film Titanic would never have been made, and that means the careers of Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet might have taken very different trajectories. The phrases "rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic" and "tip of the iceberg" might not have entered common usage with quite the same meanings. The band playing as the ship went down, the stories of heroism and cowardice, the dramatic class divisions in who survived and who perished, all of these narrative elements that have captivated audiences for over a century would simply be absent from our cultural consciousness. Now let's consider the technological implications. The Titanic disaster exposed critical flaws in ship design and emergency procedures that led to innovations we take for granted today. The double hull design, improved bulkhead construction, better lifeboat davit systems, and more efficient evacuation procedures all resulted from studying what went wrong on that April night. Without the disaster to learn from, naval architects would have continued designing ships with the same fundamental vulnerabilities. The evolution of ship safety would have followed a much slower, more incremental path, learning from smaller disasters and near misses rather than from one catastrophic failure that shocked the world. The International Ice Patrol, established in 1913 as a direct response to the Titanic sinking, would not have been created, at least not then. This organization, which monitors iceberg danger in the North Atlantic and has not had a single loss of life from ship-iceberg collisions in the area it patrols since its inception, might have taken decades longer to form. How many ships would have struck icebergs in those intervening years? How many sailors and passengers would have died preventable deaths because the warning system wasn't in place? Radio communication protocols were revolutionized after the Titanic disaster. Before the sinking, there was no requirement for 24-hour radio watches on ships and no standardized distress signals. The Californian, a ship that was close enough to potentially rescue Titanic passengers, had its radio operator asleep when the distress signals were being sent. After the disaster, regulations required continuous radio monitoring and established the SOS signal as the International Distress Call. Without the Titanic sinking to prompt these changes, maritime radio communication would have remained haphazard and unreliable for years, leading to delayed or missed rescue attempts in other emergencies. Consider also the economic ripples. The White Star Line paid out substantial claims to survivors and families of victims, and the disaster damaged the company's reputation. Eventually, White Star merged with its rival Cunard in 1934, partly due to financial struggles that can be traced back to the Titanic's loss. Without the disaster, White Star might have remained an independent, dominant force in transatlantic shipping throughout the 1920s and 1930s. The competitive dynamics of the shipping industry would have been entirely different, potentially affecting immigration patterns, trade routes, and the development of passenger air travel, which eventually superseded ocean liners as the primary means of crossing the Atlantic. The insurance industry was profoundly affected by the Titanic disaster. The loss represented one of the largest insurance claims in history up to that point, forcing insurers to completely reassess how they calculated risk for maritime ventures. New actuarial methods were developed, and insurance premiums for shipping increased dramatically across the industry. This led to more conservative shipping practices and greater investment in safety measures because the financial cost of disasters had become clear. Without the Titanic's sinking to shock the insurance industry into reform, risk assessment for maritime ventures would have evolved much more slowly, potentially leading to underinsured vessels and financial catastrophes when other ships inevitably sank. Let's talk about some specific individuals whose survival would have had measurable historical impacts. Thomas Andrews, the Titanic's builder and chief designer, died in the sinking. He was only 39 years old, and at the peak of his creative powers. Andrews was known as a brilliant naval architect, and his premature death cut short a career that might have produced revolutionary ship designs in the decades that followed. If he had survived, Andrews would have been in his prime during the 1920s and 1930s, an era of tremendous innovation in maritime engineering. His designs could have influenced everything from military vessels used in World War I to luxury liners of the interwar period. The ships he never designed might have been safer, faster, or more efficient than what was actually built in our timeline. Captain Edward Smith, who also went down with the ship, was one of the White Star Line's most experienced and respected commanders. His death ended a distinguished career, but his survival would have meant facing intense scrutiny and possibly blame for the disaster that almost happened. Even if the Titanic had narrowly missed the iceberg, the close call might have prompted investigations into why the ship was traveling at near full speed through a known ice field. Smith might have faced professional consequences, or he might have been hailed as the captain whose skill avoided catastrophe. Either way, his continued influence on maritime training and practices would have shaped how other captains approached safety decisions. The engineers who stayed at their posts to keep the lights and pumps running while the ship sank were all killed. These men represented some of the best technical minds in British maritime engineering. Their survival would have meant their experience and expertise continued contributing to ship design and operation for decades. Some of them might have become chief engineers on other vessels, training the next generation of maritime engineers with lessons from both their experience on the Titanic and the close call that nearly ended in disaster. In the alternate timeline where the Titanic doesn't sink, the ship herself continues in service for decades. She becomes the flagship of the White Star Line's fleet, making regular crossings between Southampton and New York. Her interior is periodically updated to match changing tastes and technologies. By the 1920s, she's been retrofitted with oil-fired boilers to replace some of her coal-burning furnaces, making her more efficient and cleaner. During World War I, she might have been pressed into service as a troop ship or hospital ship, carrying thousands of soldiers across the Atlantic. Unlike her sister ship Britannic, which struck a mine and sank in 1916, the Titanic in this timeline survives the war and returns to commercial service. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, the Titanic becomes an iconic symbol of the transatlantic crossing. Generations of travelers experience her grand staircase, her luxurious staterooms, and her famous restaurants. Instead of being remembered for a single tragic voyage, she's remembered for thousands of successful ones. Hollywood stars, politicians, business tycoons, and royalty all sail aboard her. She appears in newsreels and photographs as a symbol of elegance and reliability. Perhaps she's eventually retired in the late 1930s or early 1940s, either scrapped for metal as the world prepares for World War II, or possibly converted into a floating hotel or museum ship, similar to the Queen Mary in Long Beach, California. Imagine visiting a Titanic museum in this alternate reality. Instead of exploring a recreation of the ship based on wreckage and survivor testimony, you're walking through the actual vessel, preserved as she was during her glory years. Children run up and down the grand staircase where wealthy Edwardians once descended in evening dress. Tourists photograph the first-class dining room where elaborate meals were served on fine china. The ship becomes a tangible connection to the early 20th century, a time capsule that survived into the modern era instead of lying in pieces on the ocean floor. But here's something really important to consider about this alternate timeline. While we like to think that averting the Titanic disaster would be an entirely positive change, the reality is more complicated. Yes, 1,500 people would have lived, and that's an enormous moral good. But the maritime safety regulations that saved countless thousands of lives in the decades after 1912 might have been delayed by years or decades. How many other ships would have sunk with terrible loss of life because the industry didn't learn the lessons that the Titanic taught? It's a troubling moral calculation. The disaster that killed 1,500 people created a global awakening about maritime safety that has since saved perhaps hundreds of thousands of lives. Without that single shocking catastrophe to force immediate change, the cumulative death toll from preventable maritime disasters throughout the 20th century might actually have been higher. This is the butterfly effect in its most complex form. We assume that preventing a disaster is always better, but sometimes disasters serve as watershed moments that force societies to confront problems they've been ignoring. The Titanic wasn't the first ship to sink due to inadequate lifeboats, poor emergency procedures, and excessive speed in dangerous waters, but it was the first one that the world couldn't ignore because it was so large, so famous, and carried so many prominent people. The disaster broke through the complacency and denial that had characterized maritime safety culture. Without it, that complacency might have continued, leading to a steady drumbeat of smaller disasters that never quite provoked the comprehensive reforms that Solus represented. In our reality, the Titanic's wreck was discovered in 1985 by Robert Ballard, lying 12,500 feet below the surface of the North Atlantic. The haunting images of the shipwreck, split in two with its bow pointing into the darkness and debris scattered across the sea floor, have become iconic. The wreck site has been visited by numerous expeditions, yielding artifacts that have been displayed in museums around the world, helping keep the story alive for new generations. In the alternate timeline, there is no wreck, no dramatic deep-sea discovery, no haunting underwater photographs. The Titanic's story would be vastly different, remembered more like her sister ship, Olympic, which had a long and successful career but never captured the public imagination in the same way. The psychology of how we remember and memorialize tragedy would also be different. The Titanic disaster has become one of the defining stories we tell about the early 20th century, alongside World War I and the great technological changes of that era. It's a story about class division, about hubris, about heroism and cowardice, about the limits of human control over nature. Without that story, our cultural memory of the Edwardian era would be shaped by different narratives. Perhaps some other disaster would have taken its place in the collective consciousness. Or perhaps our understanding of that period would be fundamentally more optimistic, less tinged with the awareness that progress and confidence can be shattered in a single night. Think about all the survivors whose lives were defined by having experienced the disaster. They carried those memories with them forever, and many of them spent decades sharing their stories with the world. Milvina Dean, the last survivor, lived until 2009, serving as a living connection to that night in 1912. In the alternate timeline, these people are just passengers who took a ship across the Atlantic. Their lives continue on different paths, without the trauma, but also without the unique historical significance. Some of them might have lived longer, healthier lives without the psychological scars of having watched people die in the freezing water. Others might have died in completely different circumstances, from World War I battles to the influenza pandemic of 1918, or simply from the ordinary causes that claim us all eventually. The wealthy first-class passengers who survived in our timeline often struggled with survivor's guilt and with accusations of having taken lifeboat spots that should have gone to women and children from lower classes. Bruce Ismay, the White Star Line's managing director, survived the sinking and faced public condemnation for the rest of his life, accused of cowardice for boarding a lifeboat. In the alternate timeline, he never faces that judgment. He continues leading the company, making decisions about future ships and business strategies without the cloud of the disaster hanging over him. Whether that's better for him personally or for the shipping industry as a whole is open to debate. As we approach the end of this journey through an alternate reality, I want you to think about what the Titanic story really means. In our timeline, it's a story about the cost of overconfidence, about the importance of preparation and safety measures, about how tragedy can strike even when we think we've thought of everything. It's a reminder that nature is powerful, that accidents happen, and that we need to respect the forces we're dealing with when we build massive ships and send them across dangerous waters. Without the disaster, that lesson would have been learned differently later, and perhaps at an even higher cumulative cost. The Titanic that never sank would have been just another ship, impressive for its time, but eventually overshadowed by newer, larger, more modern vessels. The Titanic that sank became immortal, frozen forever in that moment of tragedy, never aging, never becoming obsolete, always representing the very pinnacle of early 20th century ambition and engineering. Which fate is better? From the perspective of the 1,500 people who died and their families, the answer is obvious. But from the perspective of the tens of thousands who were saved by the safety regulations that followed, the answer is less clear. What we can say with certainty is that a single event, a ship striking an iceberg on a cold April night, sent ripples through time that we're still feeling today. Change that one event, and you change everything that followed. The ships that were built, the regulations that were passed, the lives that were lived or lost, the stories we tell ourselves about progress and disaster. The world of the alternate timeline where the Titanic succeeded would be recognizably similar to ours in most ways. People would still have fought World War I, the 1920s would still have roared, the Depression would still have devastated economies. But the details would be different, the specific humans living those experiences would be different, and our collective understanding of risk, safety, and the relationship between humanity and the natural world would have evolved along a different path. So what would have happened if the Titanic had not sunk? 1,500 people would have lived, at least for a while longer. The White Star Line would have celebrated a triumph instead of mourning a disaster. The ship herself would have continued sailing for decades, eventually being retired or scrapped rather than lying on the ocean floor. But the world would also have been without the powerful lessons that the disaster taught, and those lessons have saved countless lives in the century since. It's a reminder that history is complex, that causes and effects ripple outward in ways we can't fully predict, and that sometimes the most significant changes come from the most tragic moments. The butterfly flaps its wings, the iceberg drifts into a different current, and the entire shape of the 20th century shifts in subtle but profound ways. And if you'd like, tell me where in the world you're watching this video from. Your comment is important, and I want to read and respond to it. For more exciting stories like this, click on the video that's playing on your screen right now.